Hi, Misha here, and quite possibly my favorite gun of the Preban era, or rather, series of guns, might surprise some. It could very well be the Daewoo series from South Korea, and there are many reasons why. So in this video, I thought I would kind of outline them and talk about a very interesting history, a very unique weapon, and something that's still very much in service today, although in updated form. So there are two members of this family. On the bottom, we have the K1a representative. This is the earliest import, the Max 1 or Maxi. And on the top, we have the K2 representative, a Max 2 or Maxi, I guess. And talk about a few Korean military accessories besides. In some ways, these guns are very similar. In fact, they started off pretty much in the same program in the 1970s. In other ways, they are very different, and that has led to some confusion. In fact, reading online, there seems to be a lot of confusion, especially about the K1 series. So, hope you will hang out with me for this weekend or early weekend video. And yeah, let's just talk about something that for a very long time was underappreciated and a great value in the pre-ban firearms world. Although these days people have kind of discovered the pleasures of Daewoo. Before we get deep into the video, these take a lot of effort to make. I really enjoy making them. I love talking about guns that I sincerely appreciate. But if you could, I would sincerely appreciate you if you could like, share, subscribe, and comment, especially if you own a Daewoo. And if you'd really like to help support things as we move into spring and summer of 2022, there's a link to the Patreon page below. During the Second World War, Korea was occupied by the Japanese army. And of course, after the end of the war, it was split into North Korea, backed by the Communist bloc, and South Korea, backed by the Western bloc. Well, sort of. That was kind of the problem. They weren't terribly well backed. They did not receive much military aid or training, and they were very self-reliant on the USA in particular as the Korean War kicked off. They were armed with M1 Grands and M1 carbines if they were lucky, but they were so short of guns. They were actually rechambered Arisakas, reworked from 7.7 millimeter to 30-06, done by the USA and given to South Korean troops, Republic of Korea troops, for that war. And keep in mind, North Korea at the time, newly communist, was quite well backed by both Russia and China. And in the very beginning of the war, it was a very uneven fight. And the Koreans in the South took note of this. Unfortunately, they still had to be reliant on the USA and the West throughout the 1950s and 60s. They didn't have the economy, the technological ability, the industrial capacity to build their own guns or even, get away and do assembly of stuff. So they were still using M1 Grands, M2, M1 carbines, grease guns, things of that nature. And at this time, North Korea has a large army. Well, enter the M16A1. South Korea sent troops to support U.S. operations in Vietnam, and there they encountered the M16A1. U.S. foreign military aid provided the South Korean military with roughly 27,000 at the time cutting-edge M16A1 rifles, and this was their first introduction to the 223 Remington, the 55 grain cartridge. And they liked it. It was well suited to them in the type of fighting, and with the hostile neighbor on the northern border, it intrigued them. And then in 1969, everyone's favorite president, Richard Nixon, as seen in Futurama, announced that the U.S. would be kind of cutting back aid in its presence and support within Southeast Asia, which left South Korea in a bit of a pickle. At the time, its president, President Park, was effectively a military dictator, and he decided to push his nation to modernize and develop its own industry. In 1970, you had the ADD, the Defense Department, basically set up to push forward technology and develop it and create it. And talks would begin with Colt to produce the M16A1 under license in South Korea. And these would be wrapped up in 1971-72, and they would build closely this version here of the M16A1. The standard model U.S. used was the Colt Model 603. The Korean version was the Colt Model 603K. And it just had a few detail differences. Nothing to speak about, but, standard gun for the most part. So they would set up what Colt called a Turnkey Factory. This would be in Busan, where everything would be kind of built, little defensible area. There were actually production going back quite a few years, and it would be at the National Arsenal, sometimes also known as the First Army Arsenal. This is wholly owned by the government at the time. The deal is struck, and by 1974, Korean licensed produced M16s joined the U.S. produced ones that Korea already had. So production is running, but President Park is not content with that. In fact, in 1972, plans were already being laid to develop this gun's successor, because the license required A, that they pay royalties, and B, that they could only produce a set number, and C, they could not export what they made. And the Koreans weren't really down for that. In the end, they would build about 600,000 M16s in South Korea. The problem is their military their standing military was just over 600,000, but if you count reserves and everything else, it was well into the millions. Again, North Korea as a neighbor, can you blame them? So they were still having to rely on older guns like the M1 Garand, grease gun, what have you, in the 1970s. So at the ADD, they were working on new programs. The XB program had been established to make something new. And in the beginning, it was going to make a rifle chambered for 7.62 NATO, because 223 just wasn't the standard yet, actually very far from it. And these early prototypes, they were named XB1, XB2, XB3, XB4, up to XB5, were very similar to the M16. They used, what we kind of colloquially call direct impingement, although in more recent terms it's become more internet to say internal piston, but otherwise you know what I mean, system, with a very similar ghost ring peep sight setup, different furniture arrangements. So these are basically AR-15s in 308. So not AR-10s like Armalite had originally made, but just scaled up. And in 1975 and 1976, they started inviting people from the military to look at what they'd cooked up, get their feedback, and go from there. Members of the Special Forces High Command saw what The Rock was cooking. See what I did there? R-O-K, R-O-C-K. Anyway, and said, yeah, that's nice, having a new rifle. But what we really need right now is a replacement for this gun here, the M3 grease gun. Also a bunch of old M1 and M2s that were wearing out carbines. What can you give us? And what can you give us pretty much right now? It needs to be lighter than the M3. It needs to be more effective than the .45 caliber round in the subgun. It also needs to be cheaper and easier to maintain, just a cost-effective gun to replace these aging relics of World War II. Again, did we mention we need it right now? And amazingly, the ADD and the arsenal responded quite rapidly. Since it was meant to replace short guns, they need to be light and all that, the original M16A1 was out with its 20-inch barrel. But luckily, after the agreement with Colt, they had the data package for the CAR-15, the XM177 as it's known, with its 11.5-inch barrel, shortened gas system, and 2-position stock. Quite a bit more compact and a little bit lighter. So that met the weight size requirements. Since they were already building the full-size rifle, it would be cost-effective using common parts too. And since it would be firing .223, it's going to have more range and accuracy and potential penetration than the .45, which, while a large round, is relatively slow and relatively short range. So that seemed to meet all the requirements. Starting with the CAR-15 as the base, and having some inspiration for the grease gun here, we end up with really Korea's first domestically designed and produced weapon. Enter the K1. Although originally, this started off, like I said, as part of the XB program and taking inspiration from their original direct impingement guns, it was known as the XB-S for short. And this would be one of the first that they scaled down to fire .223. And it borrowed very heavily from the CAR-15, keeping the short carbine length gas system, having a very comparable barrel, although slightly shorter. Still being, like I said, direct impingement. That's the main thing, and something the internet sometimes gets wrong or confuses. So very, very similar in that sense. But not using the buffer tube and system from the AR-15. Instead, it has a unique system, and we'll look inside later. And it actually uses a stock very much inspired by the grease guns, a retractable stock. However, whereas this one is cheap and simple and light, it's not terribly comfortable. Since this is firing a more powerful round, it's given a rubber checkered butt plate with a curve to it so it'll stick to your shoulder well. And it's actually quite long with 3 positions. So, honestly, it's a remarkably good stock for that day and time. The pistol grip looks similar to M16, but whereas this is hollow, this is actually has a compartment inside, something a lot of modern grips do, for a small cleaning kit. Of course, it fires the standard .223 .55 grain round, so it's a 1 in 12 twist, and it even uses standard AR-15 magazines. And it has its own unique receiver, of course, but it's very much based on the technology they obtained from Colt for their production of alloy receivers. And the trigger group is very similar, although slightly different. The sights, again, are 2-position flip here, really kind of meant for short range. And they were able to turn the XBS into the XK1 around 1977. And the first prototypes were ready by 1980. And after initial testing, they were accepted for service in 1981 as the K1. Now, the K1a quickly came in 1982. And the K1a had a new flash hider and also introduced a new fire mode selector, but we'll come back to that. But yeah, this was their first gun. It's not too far off from an AR-15, just really with the different recoil system of note. But they were just getting started in Korea. And notice I haven't mentioned Daewoo as a name yet, because at this time it's not being used, but it soon would be. Today in the USA, the Daewoo name is synonymous with automobiles, but actually they did not start making cars until around 1986. The Daewoo Precision Industry Firearms Division was set up in 1981, and it was based on the old National Arsenal, Arsenal 1, but was nominally a private corporation, a private business, versus a state-controlled industry. President Park, again a dictator, had pushed in some good directions, certainly had developed South Korea's industry in the 1970s, but maybe overdid it in some ways and neglected certain areas. Either way, it led to his assassination in 1979, and the new president, President Chun, came in and started to restructure things to make them more efficient and competitive. It's a big thing, just trying to give you the nuts and bolts. And so firearms, their development, design, manufacturing fell under a new ministry, the Ministry of National Defense, and the previously state-run, owned arsenal became Daewoo Precision Industries. Don't at me, I know that's highly condensed, but gives you the idea, right? I hope. And then we can return to the firearms here and finally get to the meat of this. The new K1, based on the Car 15, satisfied the need of special forces, drivers, commanders, communications, but it was kind of a rush job. They didn't have major funding, time, they put it together, but it did teach them a lot of things and ended up being a very good gun. But the idea to have a full rifle to replace the M16A1 was still there. Like I said, the first 5 prototypes were direct impingement, firing 7.62. The 6th, XB6, believe that or not, was the first to employ an AK-style long stroke gas piston, something they were borrowing from their neighbors up north. Still firing 7.62 though. The reason they did not think about using the long stroke for the carbine was weight plus time. It needed more time to be worked out. They liked it, but by this point 223 is becoming much more a standard, and so they scaled it down for that, becoming the XB7. Then they would continue some testing. This would evolve into the XB7C. And then around 1981, 1982, this was renamed to XK2, like we had the XK1 previously. And a small run was produced at the newly named Daewoo factory for firearms and submitted for field trials and feedback. And from that, we ended up with the full production K2 here, which was tested and accepted in 1984, put into mass production in 1985, and started to actually be seen in the field and replace some M16s by 1987. They wanted to be able to produce at least 1 million of these to arm frontline troops, and that allowed them to shift their over 500,000 M16A1s to more second-line troops, training, and then the third line, the true reservists, could still pick up other guns like M1 Grands if necessary. So, yeah, this is in some ways very similar to the K1, in other ways very different. It still fires 223. At least the first versions had the 1 in 12 twist, but very soon they would go to the not 1 in 7, but technically 1 in 7.3 twist for the heavier 62 grain bullet. It is, like I said, a long stroke gas piston system. We have, of course, a full length barrel. Interestingly, the K2 uses the K1a's 3-slot flash hider. Kind of neat. Of course, it still feeds from AR-15 magazines, Stanag mags, but 30 rounders are starting to come more into use by this point. And we now have a folding stock. And we have sights that are more appropriate for a true rifle vis-a-vis a submachine gun, which is what they class the K1A as. Now, if you wonder if Colt protested about all this, oh yes they did. In the 70s, they kicked a fit when South Korea stopped paying royalties, and in the 80s, they actually sued them for breach of contract and using their patents. But because the K1 and K2 were different enough, and because of wanting to keep friendly relations in the region, Colt lost the lawsuit. And what South Korea gained was a more competitive industry, a more effective one, a way to produce their own guns, a way to be less reliant on the USA and Colt. And they gained a couple of damn fine firearms. Now with the history and development out of the way, and yes, I do know that many find it boring, but it is so critical to these guns. But now that we're through that, how are the K1 K1a and the K2 different and similar? Well, ignoring the fact this is a semi-auto in the US, it should have a 10.4 inch barrel. And with the stock collapsed in like this, that gives it an overall length of just under 26 inches. And it weighs about 6.3 pounds. The K2 has an 18.3 inch barrel, and with its stock folded like this, it's about 29 inches, so not significantly longer. And it's less than a pound heavier. It's about 7.2 pounds. Pretty effective, quite frankly. With the K2's stock deployed, we're at about 39 inches overall. Here is the K1 with its stock in the middle position, and it actually goes out really far. On the military version with the short barrel, it's just right at 33 inches. So fully deployed, it's still quite a bit shorter, but in the intermediate position, I don't know, we're looking at about 30 inches. So quite a compact little gun and lightweight. They use the same muzzle device, a very effective one. It's threaded half by 28, but the thread pitch is a little bit, a little bit longer, frankly. The K1 is direct impingement with a non-adjustable gas system. The K2, long stroke gas piston with a 4-position system. Very reminiscent plug, like you might see on the FAL, but 4 positions instead of 2. You have O for closed, grenade launching, L, M, and S for large, medium, and small port size. So quite nice. We have an exposed gas tube and barrel for ventilation here. Standard Sling mounts, really. Synthetic handguards. A1-esque, but different. Moving to the receivers, even though these are totally different receivers from an AR-15, you can tell they were made with the same technology. They're forged aluminum alloy, upper and lower halves. As I said, the trigger groups are very similar. The mag catch on both, very similar. The sights, 2-position on the K1. On the K2, it goes from 200 to 600 meters adjustable plus windage. Basically, the K1 is expected to work out to about 250 meters. The K2 effective to at least 450. Both have the pistol grip with storage, and both have rubber coated butt plates, although the K2's is smooth. And both have reciprocating and upswept charging handles, cocking handles. which can honestly double as a forward assist if you need to. Now the K1 on top of the receiver is smooth except for the sights. The K2, in a pretty forward-thinking notion for its time, is actually drilled and tapped with 2 mounts for an optic. Although in the beginning that would not be a standard feature, it was an option from the get-go. Not bad. Oh, and there's no port door on these, no dust cover. Flipping these over, we can see a bolt release here. Interestingly, for whatever reason, they did not make it where you could use it as a hold open. Although I suppose you could probably pry it back if you needed to. It is a little different shape on the K1 to let the stock collapse in. And they both have the fire mode selector here. And it actually rotates all the way. Although, not when I don't have them cocked, sorry. But it rotates 360. The original K1 had a 3-way selector. Safe, semi, and auto. The K1a was the first to introduce a burst mode, a 4th position, and so that was carried over to the K2 since it was developed shortly after the K1. You can see where they shared parts and they learned things from each other. And again, Korea would make their own magazines and accessories and parts and what have you. But these were produced. In fact, they would end up making over 1 million for use in the various branches, including the Army, the Navy, and the Marines. And they're still in use today, frankly. I will also add that these have a very durable, very nice phosphate anodized combination finish versus the steel. They do have chrome-lined barrels. The K1a was made with a 1 in 12 twist originally, whereas like I said earlier, the K2 was almost always 1 in 7.3 from the get-go. This was made for what Korea called the KM193 round, 55 grain. This was made for the KM100 round, 62 grain. And they would make their own magazines. I put a modern Korean steel mag in, which is kind of a copy of the British-Israeli pattern. I thought it was appropriate for the gun. It's impossible to convey on a video how smooth these are and how well they feel in the hands. And this is coming from someone who owns Berettas and SIGs and other things. And while I'm not saying the Daewoo is better than that, I'm saying they hold up remarkably well considering how affordable they were in the 80s and even up until around 2015. Both models disassemble in a very similar manner. You have a captive front push pin on both, but no pin in the back. Instead you have a latch button, so it opens up 2 shells. These are not interchangeable, of course, except for the trigger components here with each other. Make sure how the selector rotates all around. Of course, this is just safe and semi, but on a military gun it would have more positions. And here we are with some of the internals. Here's the K2 single recoil spring. Here's our long stroke piston. Some of these have a lock to join the piston and bolt together. Others, it's just held in by the receiver. When you take it out, they fall apart. Most of those are that way. It's an AR style bolt head. The only difference is the ejector is housed in the receiver, not the bolt on an AR. And these are not parts interchangeable. Like I said, one main spring, very AK style. As for the K1a pattern, it's a little different. We have a different short bolt here. Same type of head though. And notice this key on top, that's to work with the dual recoil spring system here. That's how they were able to have a collapsing stock. This is the button you push in to disassemble it. Smooth button. And of course here is our cocking handle. It comes out in a spot in the track, pretty standard. One change they made after that on the K1 to the K2, they added a lock here, so this could not accidentally disassemble itself in the field. The earliest K2s used the same style of latch as the K1, but you can understand why this was an important update, because this was a gun meant to be issued in the hundreds of thousands, not tens of thousands. It was going to be in more conscripts' hands and be used longer and harder, so they had to find a few ways to better proof it against, accidents and what have you in the field. And again, the K1 was first, the K2 came second, so it did benefit from some of those updates. Now let's talk briefly about some kind of cool accessories. Reassembling these, it always amazes me how easy they go together. In some guns where you have to pull out the charging handle, you have to get it just in the right spot. Not with these, it's pretty generous. The handle may be a bit of a weak point, if anything, but it's not a failure point. I would also point out that the gas piston system in the K2 is noticeably lighter than that found in the AK. Also, there's a recoil buffer. It's spring-loaded, not rubber, in the lower receiver of each one, just to help make things a little gentler. So with that, let's talk about accessories a wee bit. Like I said, a rail mount could be added from the get-go, or a scope ring or a scope, although for most versions it was not. They would typically use them with 30-round mags, although there are plenty of 20-rounders in South Korea too. This is a modern steel one, but I grabbed it. It's actually a pretty nice mag for as cheap as these were. The Sling here is South Korean. It's a copy of the M16 M1 Grand Sling. It's just made of a slightly newer nylon material, shorter. It does have the typical clip. I just take mine off because it's not needed and it might scuff things up and rattle, and but it's there if you want it. Here's that pistol grip cleaning kit. Notice it's very FAL style, 2 compartments. The small one's for a small oil pot. The large one actually holds a bore brush and little rope. Again, very FAL. There's some patches that just happened to be in mine. Just held in. This wouldn't be the standard cleaning kit they'd use. It was for emergencies only. Keep in mind, these were meant for mass issue. The K1 did not have a bayonet lug, of course, but the K2 did, and it took the standard M7 type American bayonet here. Pretty neat looking. I don't have a Korean bayonet. These didn't come with them in the 80s, but and of course, maybe the coolest accessory we have here. This is the South Korean copy of the American clip-on bipod. I'm not going to put it on my gun just to scratch it up. You see these on the original M16, M16A1s. It mounts to a spot right here under the barrel. This spot was also used for a South Korean copy of the 40mm M203 grenade launcher called the K201, so a single shot 40 mil. Like I said, you could also use it to clip on this bipod, and these were issued often when someone was expected to use one of these guns as a DMR. Typically it was issued with a 4-power scope on top of that. But the neatest feature of this bipod is right here. If I can get it out, set you down for a second. Sarsaparilla, anyone? Or maybe a Nuka-Cola? Yeah. Some say that the Galil ARM has a bottle opener. This definitely does. Right in here, it's even spring-loaded, and this is a serious bottle opener. You could do a lot of bottle opening with this. So that just kind of makes this a unique little clip-on bipod. It's also pretty heavy, all things considered. Standard pouch with the Alice clip on the back. Yeah. Oh, and this bipod, the legs are spring-loaded too, which is nice. Keeps it on your gun. It's a pretty well-designed thing. A lot of what South Korea used with these was either from the USA, licensed produced, from Colt, unlicensed produced, or copies of. So by the late 80s, these were both standard. Like I said, the K1a was used as a carbine or a submachine gun. The Marines, the South Korean Marines, really like them and have used them quite a bit. And that's no small thing. The ROK Marine Force is the largest in the region, Southeast Asia, because of, well, it's surrounded by water so much. Also vehicle drivers, special forces, yada yada. But they only have several thousands. The K2, on the other hand, has been produced in large numbers to the tune of upwards of 1 million. And this is for just general issue to everyone. Professional soldiers, conscripts, reservists. It was designed to beat North Korea's AK-47 and derivatives. They wanted it to have the simplicity, reliability, ease of maintenance compared with the AK, but they wanted it to be lighter weight, more flexible, hence the folding stock that the military insisted on, the scope mount, and they wanted to have greater accuracy, the longer barrel, the more finely adjustable sights. Yeah, it needed to be superior in a lot of ways, too. And by the way, the hinge on this folding stock is very, a lot of people compare it to the FAL style, and that's fair, but the FAL has a latch down below, as does the FNC. To me, it very much reminds me in the hinge department like the Galil Ace. And there are other elements that are kind of from other guns here, too. Like I said, the front plug reminds me of an FAL. This structure up here kind of reminds me of an HK triple frame in a lot of ways. This flash hider is interesting. The 3-prong, it's like an A2 but with less slots, and yes, they are meant to be cocked to the right side a bit to better check for recoil. Even has a check nut here. Sometimes people don't do that. Also, back to the gas plug for a minute. Make sure when you're shooting these, it actually sits at an angle too, kind of to mirror this. Make sure it's not up or upright, or it's not locked in. The reason I say that, more than a few people have gone to shoot these, not having to have that locked in, and it goes flying out, and good luck trying to find a replacement now. So yeah, they were prevalent throughout the ROK, the military, in the 90s, and production would continue apace. In fact, they're still officially in production today. They have seen combat in places like Iraq and Afghanistan as well, and are generally well regarded. Typically, Korea organizes an infantry squad into 9 members, and 2 of them would get a K2 with the underbarrel grenade launcher. A couple of them would have the K11, which is an interesting gun in and of itself. One guy would get the K3, the light machine gun. And then the rest of the guys would either get to standard K2s or K1s, kind of mixing it up as they needed it for the mission. And of course, the standard pistol has been for a long time Daewoo's own K5, which I've done several videos on that as well. This worked fine for a long time. In 1999, post-Cold War, Daewoo a huge conglomerate essentially broke apart, and there would be several name changes. Most importantly, S&T Motiv would start to be used as a name in 2012, and in some instances is still used today for the factory that was originally established as the first Army arsenal way back in the 70s. And they're still officially in production. Unfortunately, by the 21st century, these were kind of considered obsolete, at least in Korea and for export. The K2 was seen as, honestly, too long for modern purposes and not flexible enough. And the K1 was seen as too heavy for what it needed to be. And yeah, so they would think of replacing them in the 21st century. Let's go back to the 80s though, because I started off this video by saying the Daewoo could quite possibly be my favorite Preban import. And I want to explain why that is and then talk about the various makes and marks and numbers you might find. First off, these were imported as shooters. They were priced very competitive for the AR-15 and AR-180 of the day. Guns like the SIG 550 and Beretta AR-70 and yeah, even the French from Moss, they were expensive by the even standards of 1980s. And you see the same thing with Kalashnikovs. The Egyptian guns brought in by Steyr were pricey. Compare that to the Chinese imports that were, priced to sell. And the Daewoos were in the price to sell camp. On top of that, they were very high quality. They took standard magazines. They had standard thread pitches. And they were full featured. The K2 types gave you the pistol grip, the folding stock, just like the military gun. If I can do this one-handed, looks like, ow, almost, so close. I'm going to set you down. Yeah, these are reasonably stiff. There you go. You see, you can just pry it open with hand, though. Anyway, now that I made an ass out of myself, we will continue. They had, standard handguards, full-featured, like bayonet lug, all that good stuff. Even have the insert for the night sight spot on top. The K1's more interesting. You don't see a lot of guns of this style imported in the 1980s. For example, the Galil SAR, the 13-inch barrel version, was never imported. This has the great retractable stock. There's no problem in the 80s with that. But the barrel. Of course, a rifle has to have a 16-inch barrel. So what they did, they extended it out. Now, some makers would go all the way out to 16 and then have a removable muzzle device. But I really like what they did here. They put on a flash hider. This is about 4 inches. And then they extended the barrel out just long enough to kind of mate up with that. So the barrel is extended, but not too egregiously, frankly, preserving a lot of the original weight and feel. In fact, with the stock fully collapsed in, this gun is about 37.5 inches long. So about 4.5 inches longer than the military. With the stock fully, fully extended stock, yeah. Fully retracted in, there we go. This is about 30 inches. Keep in mind the military gun was about 25, 26 fully in, and 33 with it fully extended. They had to do it. I'm sure some people lament it, but it could have been oh so much worse. Imagine if the threads were here and the flash hider went on top of that. At least this doesn't look completely ridiculous. And so I do appreciate them for that. These guns shipped with the sling, 1 mag, and the pistol grip cleaning kit. The select fire versions of these guns started to appear in Daewoo's military catalog around 1984. Like I said, that's the same time they were officially adopted. And it's amazing how quickly the semi-autos appeared here. As early as 1985, certainly by 86, they were available. And our first importer was Stoeger, or Stoeger as my speech says. And it was under this brand name of Max 1, MAX, Roman numeral 1, and Max 2, MAX, Roman numeral 2. Although I've often heard it said Maxi. And there's not a lot of change with the civilian guns, just as in the military, except these early ones you can rotate the safety fully around. Later ones, you can't rotate it the top way. You have to just go down below. I've noticed that as a difference. Now, during the Stoeger run, the name would change to make it a little more identifiable. The rifle would become the K2, just K2. Fair enough. The carbine would become the K1A1. Remember the military version, K1A. The later Stoegers are K1A1s. Now, by 1987, Stoeger would give away to a new company, IA Incorporated. And they would continue importing them as K2 and K1A1 for a time. And then around 1988, they would change the name yet again. The rifle would become AR-100. And the carbine would become AR-110C. Okay. No real other changes, although we should point out that with the AR-100s, you can often see an area where K2 is machined out in an oval and then the AR-100 name restamped. No one knows why the name change happened, but we mostly speculate it was to make these seem a little more competitive and attractive with the growing popularity of the AR-15 and AR-180 for that matter. The K1 types were always 1 in 12 twist, at least the import runs. The K2 types, though, started off as 1 in 12, but they would transition over to the 1 in 7.3. The problem is it's hard to identify when, because we don't really know a lot about serial numbers. Rough guesstimate, around serial number 32,000, give or take. We don't really know. These started off with serials in the high 2s or low 3s, and they would run through the 4s, and the Preban guns would get up to about 5 prefix serials. The K1 types were imported in much smaller numbers, so their serials were like 02, 03 in that block, in that range. And so those would be your two Preban importers. Of course, in March of 1989, the rules changed. Done complete videos on that. The post-ban era for the Daewoo would begin in 1990 with a new importer, B West. Of course, these guns were out because of their features, and a new model was in, the DR200. Now, the K1 series is gone. They never tried to make this compliant with the new rules. The K2, they modified with a thumbhole stock. Obviously, it could not fold. They machined off the bayonet lug. And sometimes these still have the threads, but they have a simple cap kind of epoxied on, stuck on. So sometimes the threads are still there. Now these would still have standard capacity mag wells because in 1990 that was still perfectly legal for importation. That would not change actually until 1998. So the series would run up to the serial numbers beginning with around 7,000. And then we would change importers to Kimber. Interestingly enough, they came in around 1994 and would be the last importer of Daewoo rifles. And they would change up the serials. The 223 versions would be starting with RA. And for the first time, Kimber would import the DR300, the same rifle, but in 7.62x39, and these serials would start with RB. The DR300s are not recommended. You can read about why, but they had issues. They were made for the commercial market, and it shows, frankly. And so Kimber importation would run up through about 1997. But when the change to magwell specs came around, that killed a bunch of imports, the Daewoo included. Also on top of that, the Daewoo factory was going through a lot of upheaval, bankruptcies, loss of profits. It itself, like I said earlier, would break up by 1999 and essentially be reformed, purchased out, everything in 2012 by S&T Motive. And they actually stopped making semi-auto Daewoos altogether some time ago. They still make the pistols, though. But that's kind of a brief rundown of the eras of imports. Very few of the K1 types came in, at least compared to the K2 types. And the DR200s are actually very nice, high quality. Do note, though, if you try to convert one, they've got a round cut receiver back here, so you can't easily restore it. Oh, and for legal purposes, the lower, just as on an AR-15, is the registered firearm part. So that's kind of where we're at today as far as these in the USA. So let's end by talking about where they're at today in South Korea. Post-Cold War budget cutbacks and, frankly, an increasingly outdated North Korean military meant that South Korea really didn't put a high priority on replacing or even updating the K1a and K2 in the early part of the 21st century. For example, special forces, if they needed rails or optics, they would just go buy them, kind of off-the-shelf procurement. But then Korean troops would operate alongside their allies in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, and the need became more and more pressing. And when S&T Motive took over in 2012, they quickly set about revamping the product line. Now, the K1a was essentially out. They didn't do a whole lot with this. This was an early design. They were ready just pretty much let it rest. Instead, they had two versions of the K2, the K2a and the K2c. The K2a had a standard 18-inch barrel. The K2c had an intermediate 12-inch barrel with corresponding shortened gas system. And these would start off having a Picatinny rail section up here on top, short though, and they would have railed handguards, and they would have a stock that could both fold and adjust, and a few other modernizations. And they were pretty much presenting to the government, hey, buy the A model to replace or update your existing, and buy the K2C just to replace the K1As outright. They tested both, and they rejected the K2C to replace the carbine. But the K2A, that intrigued them, and actually would evolve into the rifle modernization program with testing around 2014-15. They would actually end up ordering new as well as having older K2s updated to the K2A standard, now reclassed by the government as K2C1. Yeah. They would continue the updates. They would go to a flat top upper receiver so they could have a longer top rail for a red dot. Finally, a 1913 rail with red dot was standard in North Korean military service. They would also go to a different pattern of railed handguard with both longer and removable rails, and they would go to kind of a Magpul style adjustable shoulder stock with this version. And by 2016, it started to see some use, and they were planning to purchase or update about 200,000 guns. And S&T Motive continued to update, revealing their own K2C1/2, which features a folding front sight and an ambidextrous selector. I don't know if the military is going to go for that or not, because they're trying to do this on a budget. As for the K1A's replacement, it took them a long time to figure out what to do, but in 2020, they announced that they were purchasing the DSA AR-15 with an 11.5-inch barrel to replace this guy. They had an initial batch of 1,000 sent over for troop trials, and then the first full order is supposed to be 15,000 with deliveries supposedly ongoing right now and to be finished by next year. So kind of gives you some ideas of the numbers in service, about 1/10 of the carbines versus the rifles. And there's been other things like different Cerakotes and stuff used, different optics. But it looks like for now that the K2 will remain South Korea's standard rifle, but the older K1 is being phased out in the 2020s. And there we have it, folks. I love history. I love technical specifications, mechanical operations, and I do love shooting too. For all those reasons, these guns have just always appealed to me. And the economics behind them were very reasonable for a number of years. I've been able to have at various times in my hands all the versions, the Max 1, Max 2, K2, K1A1, AR100, AR10C, and so I can tell you there's not much difference, just minor things. For example, some of the earliest versions of this don't have the little protective latch, and some of the later ones do have the lock that keeps the carrier and bolt together. Very few changes for the K1 types, though. They just seem to always be playing second fiddle. And I think that's because the K2 is so well known for its gas piston that people overlook the direct impingement. They're both remarkably fun shooters and very, very smooth shooting. We actually did a video comparing this to the XM177 at the range, and sorry about that. For what it is, it's a very smooth shooting gun, and this thing is just a pleasure. This stock is solid, nice rubber butt plate, nice, simple, comfortable pistol grip. Of course, it's very 1980s. Don't expect modern ergonomics out of either of these. But if you go in with your expectations reasonable, yeah, they're really a lot of fun. I just couldn't help but talk about them today. Don't have a whole lot new in the gun shop to go on about, so these just seem like something to drag out again. I always love the chance. Anyway, hope you enjoyed it, and hope you have a good weekend. If you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to help support the channel, please check out the link to the Patreon page. This is Misha. Catch you very soon next time.